I'm Keisha Williams, 42 years old, and 3 months ago, a racist incident happened at Bellacourt Fine Dining that changed everything. The humiliation I felt walking out of that restaurant still makes my chest tight. But what the management did next when I tried to address it was even worse. If you've ever experienced racism in restaurants, retail, or any service industry, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. Growing up in Oakland, my grandmother Nana May used to tell me, "Baby girl, you got to be twice as good to get half as much, but don't you ever let that stop you from being excellent." She'd say this while teaching me to make her famous cornbread in the kitchen that always smelled like vanilla and love. Nana May had been a housekeeper for white families her whole life, but she made sure I understood that education was my ticket to something better. My mama Sandra worked double shifts as a nurse to put me through UC Berkeley, and every Sunday after church at Mount Olive Baptist, she'd quiz me on my business classes while we had dinner with my Aunt Thelma and cousin Peter. I remember being the only black student in most of my graduate business courses at Stanford. Professor Anderson, a white man who became one of my strongest advocates, pulled me aside after I aced a particularly difficult strategic planning exam. "Keisha," he said, "you have a gift for seeing opportunities others miss. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." That conversation happened in 2008, and I carried those words through every boardroom where I was the only face that looked like mine. Learning to code switch became second nature, speaking one way with my family and community, another way in corporate settings where my natural speech patterns might be judged as unprofessional. By 2015, I'd worked my way up to senior consultant at Morrison & Associates, one of the top restaurant and hospitality consulting firms in the Bay Area. I specialized in restaurant turnarounds, taking failing establishments and transforming them into profitable businesses. My success rate was 85%, higher than any other consultant in the firm. I'd helped save over 30 restaurants, creating hundreds of jobs in the process. The industry recognized my expertise. I spoke at conferences, wrote articles for trade publications, and had earned enough respect that restaurant owners specifically requested me by name. My personal life reflected that same intentionality and success. I'd bought my own home in Oakland Hills, was sending my nephew through college, and had started a scholarship fund at Mount Olive for kids pursuing business degrees. Every month I'd have dinner with my girls, Denise, my college roommate, who became a doctor, and Jasmine, my sorority sister who ran a nonprofit. We'd meet at different restaurants around the Bay Area supporting Black-owned businesses when we could find them, but often ending up in establishments where we had to navigate the subtle ways service differed when Black women walked through the door. The signs were always there if you knew how to look. The way hostesses would pause just a beat too long before seating us. How servers would ask if we were sure we wanted to order wine or suggest more affordable menu options. The microaggression of being asked multiple times if we were ready to pay while white tables nearby lingered for hours. I'd learned to document these experiences mentally, understanding that calling them out in the moment often led to being labeled as difficult or aggressive. But I was successful enough, respected enough that most of the time these incidents felt like annoying obstacles rather than threats to my livelihood. That confidence, that sense of security made what happened at Bellacourt even more shocking. I'd scheduled a business dinner there with potential clients Martin Chen and Rebecca Torres, who were looking to hire a consultant for their struggling restaurant chain. Bellacourt had a reputation for excellent service and sophisticated cuisine, exactly the kind of place where high-level business gets conducted. I'd made the reservation under my company name Morrison & Associates, confirming twice because the meeting was crucial for landing the largest contract of my career. Walking into Bellacourt that Tuesday evening in April, I felt the familiar confidence that came from knowing I belonged in any room I entered. I was wearing my favorite navy blue suit from Theory, carrying my leather portfolio, every inch the successful businesswoman I'd worked so hard to become. The restaurant's elegant interior, cream walls, soft lighting, fresh flowers on every table should have been the perfect setting for closing this deal. But as I approached the hostess stand, I noticed the young white woman's smile falter slightly when she looked up at me. The cultural foundation my family built for me started long before I could understand its importance. Sunday dinners at Nana May's house weren't just about food, they were about understanding who we were and where we came from. She'd tell stories about my great-grandfather who'd been a Pullman porter traveling the country at a time when Black men couldn't stay in the hotels where they worked. He kept his dignity, she'd say, no matter how they tried to break him down. Mama had her own way of preparing me for the world. Baby, she'd say while braiding my hair for school, some folks gonna try to make you feel less than. You remember who you are, a child of God, smart as anyone in that room and deserving of respect. The talk in our house wasn't just about police brutality, it was about navigating white spaces with excellence as armor and community as strength. By the time I reached high school, I understood the game. I learned to speak with what my friends called my white voice during job interviews and professional settings, switching back to my natural speech patterns when I got home. I studied twice as hard as my white classmates, knowing that any mistake would be attributed to my race rather than seen as an individual failing. When I got into Stanford for my MBA, Nana May cried tears of pride. You're opening doors, she said, not just for yourself, but for every Black child coming behind you. The restaurant industry taught me early about both overt and subtle racism. During my first consulting job in 2010, I walked into a client meeting at an upscale Italian restaurant in San Francisco. The owner, Tony Marcelli, took one look at me and asked if I was there for a job application. When I explained I was the consultant his partners had hired, his face went through a series of expressions before settling on forced politeness. Oh, he said, I was expecting someone more experienced. I was 28 years old with an MBA from Stanford and 3 years of consulting experience, but in his mind I couldn't possibly be qualified to help his business. That meeting taught me to arrive early for client dinners, to dress impeccably, and to speak with absolute authority about my credentials. I learned to send detailed bios ahead of meetings, ensuring clients knew exactly who they were hiring. Most importantly, I learned to document everything. Every conversation, every email, every slight, because I understood that in a world where my competence was constantly questioned, having proof became essential. Professional success in predominantly white spaces required constant code switching and cultural translation. In boardrooms, I spoke in the measured tones and industry jargon that marked me as serious and competent. I knew when to smile, when to be firm, when to laugh at mediocre jokes from white male clients who needed to feel comfortable around me. But I never forgot who I was or where I came from. During lunch breaks, I'd call Denise or Jasmine, letting my natural voice and personality shine through as we debriefed the latest workplace drama. The Black professional network I'd built became my lifeline. Peter had become a successful architect, and we'd meet monthly to discuss the unique challenges of being excellent in spaces that weren't designed for us. The exhaustion is real, he'd say over drinks at a Black-owned wine bar in Oakland, always having to prove you belong, always having to be perfect. We'd swap stories about being the only one in meetings, about clients who were surprised by our competence, about the careful balance between authenticity and acceptance. My reputation in the industry grew steadily. Restaurant owners began requesting me specifically, knowing I could turn around their failing businesses. I'd helped transform a failing soul food restaurant in Richmond into a thriving establishment that celebrated Black culinary traditions while attracting diverse clientele. I'd consulted on a Mexican restaurant in San Jose that became a community gathering place after implementing my recommendations for inclusive marketing and culturally sensitive menu development. By early 2024, I was at the peak of my career. Morrison & Associates had promoted me to senior partner, making me the first Black woman to reach that level in the firm's history. My success had opened doors for other consultants of color. I made sure to mentor young Black professionals entering the industry, sharing the navigation strategies that had served me well. My annual income had reached 6 figures, and I was being courted by larger firms who wanted to recruit me away from Morrison. The confidence this success brought was intoxicating. I walked into any restaurant, any boardroom, any professional space, knowing I had earned my place there. My expertise was recognized industry-wide. I'd been featured in Restaurant Business magazine and had given a keynote speech at the National Restaurant Association conference. When white colleagues or clients questioned my suggestions, I had the track record to back up my authority. This professional security made me comfortable in ways that earlier in my career I couldn't afford to be. I would politely but firmly correct servers who assumed I couldn't afford expensive wine. I'd look hostesses in the eye when they seemed reluctant to seat me in prime dining areas. I'd become accustomed to eventual recognition and respect, even when initial interactions were tainted by bias. That Tuesday evening in April, walking into Bellacourt Fine Dining, I embodied all of this hard-earned confidence. The reservation was under Morrison and Associates. My clients Martin and Rebecca were expecting to meet with one of the most respected restaurant consultants in the Bay Area. I was wearing my power suit, carrying my leather portfolio, every inch the successful professional I'd worked 15 years to become. The hostess, a blonde woman in her early 20s whose name tag read Madison, looked up from her reservation book with a smile that died the moment she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone shifting from welcoming to cautious. "I have a reservation for 3 under Morrison and Associates," I said, maintaining the professional warmth I'd perfected over years of client interactions. Madison flipped through her reservation book, her brow furrowed. "Morrison and Associates," she repeated slowly. "And you are?" "Keisha Williams, senior partner," I replied, extending my business card. "I'm expecting 2 clients to join me shortly." She stared at the business card for a long moment, then looked back at me. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion. The reservation is for Morrison and Associates, and I was expecting—" She paused, clearly searching for diplomatic phrasing, "someone different." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd experienced variations of this conversation countless times before. The difference was that this time I was at the height of my professional power, carrying credentials that should have made this kind of treatment impossible. "I am Morrison and Associates," I said firmly, "senior partner. My credentials are on the card you're holding." Madison's face flushed pink, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "Well, we're completely booked tonight," she said, closing the reservation book. "I don't have any tables available." I could see at least 6 empty tables from where I stood. The lunch crowd had long since departed, and the dinner rush hadn't yet begun. "My reservation was confirmed this morning," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "Morrison and Associates, 6:30 p.m., party of 3. "Like I said," Madison replied, her chin lifting slightly, "we're completely booked." The familiar feelings washed over me, the heat of embarrassment, the rapid heartbeat of fight-or-flight response, the hypervigilance that came from recognizing a racial incident in real time. But underneath those automatic responses was something new, pure outrage. I had earned the right to be treated with respect. My success, my credentials, my track record should have protected me from this kind of blatant discrimination. "Is there a manager available?" I asked, proud that my voice remained steady. Madison hesitated, then disappeared into the back of the restaurant. I stood in the foyer, acutely aware of the other diners glancing in my direction. A white couple who'd arrived after me was immediately seated at one of the unavailable tables. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, potentially the most qualified person in the building to evaluate restaurant operations, being refused service because of my skin color. 5 minutes passed before Madison returned with a tall white man in his 40s wearing a crisp white shirt and black tie. His name tag identified him as David, assistant manager. "Good evening," David said with practiced politeness. "I understand there's been some confusion about your reservation." I repeated my information, showed him my business card, and explained that I was expecting clients for a business dinner. David examined my card carefully, then checked the reservation book. "Miss Williams," he said finally, "I apologize for the confusion, but we have a strict dress code here. I'm afraid your attire doesn't meet our standards for dining in the main restaurant." I looked down at my Navy theory suit, my conservative heels, my minimal jewelry, the exact outfit I'd worn to close million-dollar consulting deals. "What specifically about my attire doesn't meet your dress code?" I asked. David's eyes darted around, clearly searching for justification. "Well, we prefer more formal business attire." "Kang? This is a business suit from Theory," I said calmly. "I'm wearing it to a business dinner. What specifically makes it inappropriate?" "The policy is subjective," David replied. "Management reserves the right to determine appropriate dress on a case-by-case basis." The gaslighting was textbook perfect, creating a policy that could be applied selectively to exclude unwanted customers while maintaining plausible deniability. I'd seen it before but never experienced it so blatantly when I had such obvious credentials and professional standing. "I'd like to speak with the general manager," I said. "I'm afraid he's not available tonight," David replied. but I'd be happy to help you find another restaurant that might be more suitable. The word suitable hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that both of us understood perfectly. At that moment, Martin and Rebecca walked through the front door, dressed in casual business attire that was significantly less formal than my outfit. "Keisha," Rebecca called out, waving enthusiastically. "Sorry we're running a few minutes late." I watched David's face as he processed the situation, his carefully constructed dress code excuse crumbling as he realized these were my actual clients and they were white. His expression shifted from confident authority to uncomfortable uncertainty. "Miss Williams," he said quickly, "perhaps we can work something out after all." But the damage was done. Martin and Rebecca had witnessed enough of the interaction to understand what was happening. The humiliation of being refused service, then suddenly accommodated only when white associates vouched for me, was complete. "Actually," I said, maintaining my professional composure, "I think we'll take our business elsewhere. There are plenty of restaurants that welcome all customers equally." As we walked out of Bellacourt, Rebecca put her hand on my arm. "Keisha, I'm so sorry, that was completely unacceptable." Martin nodded grimly. "We'll make sure to share this experience with others in the industry. That kind of treatment is inexcusable." Their support meant everything, but it couldn't erase the sting of what had just happened. I'd been at the pinnacle of my professional success, and still my credentials couldn't protect me from the oldest form of discrimination in American service industries. That night, I called Denise first. "Girl," she said after I'd recounted the entire incident, "you know what you have to do. This isn't just about you. It's about every Black person who's been treated like this and didn't have your platform to fight back." Jasmine was equally supportive but more strategic. "Document everything," she advised. "Every detail, every witness, every policy they claim to have. If you're going to take this on, you need to be prepared for them to come at you with everything they've got." The next morning, I called Bellacourt to report the incident to upper management. The general manager, Thomas Brennan, agreed to meet with me that afternoon. I arrived with detailed notes about the incident, copies of my business cards, and a clear account of the discriminatory treatment I'd received. Brennan, a heavy-set white man in his 50s, listened to my story with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Miss Williams," he said when I finished, "I want to apologize for your experience. That's absolutely not the kind of service we pride ourselves on." "I appreciate that," I replied. "What steps will you take to ensure this doesn't happen to other customers?" Brennan's expression became more guarded. "Well, we'll certainly review our policies and provide additional training to our staff." "What specific policies?" I pressed. "Your assistant manager claimed there was a dress code that my business suit violated. Can you show me where that's documented?" "Our dress code is flexible," Brennan said carefully. "We trust our staff to use good judgment." Good judgment that resulted in me being refused service while less formally dressed white customers were seated immediately. Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Miss Williams, I think there may have been a genuine misunderstanding. Our staff deals with a lot of walk-in customers who aren't serious diners." The implication was clear. He was suggesting that Black customers were more likely to be unserious diners who couldn't afford to eat at Bellacourt. The racist assumption underlying their flexible dress code was exactly what I'd suspected. "Mr. Brennan," I said, "I'm a senior partner at Morrison & Associates. I've consulted for some of the finest restaurants in the Bay Area. I was meeting with clients about a potential $1 million project. Exactly what about me suggested I wasn't a serious diner?" "Now, I didn't mean to imply you absolutely did mean to imply," I interrupted. "Your staff made assumptions based on my race, then created justifications to refuse me service. When that failed, your assistant manager invented a dress code violation that somehow didn't apply to my white clients." Brennan's demeanor shifted from apologetic to defensive. "Miss Williams, I think you're reading too much into what was clearly a misunderstanding. Our staff serves customers of all backgrounds every day. Then you'll have no problem providing me with your actual dress code policy in writing, along with documentation of how it's applied consistently to all customers." "Our policies are proprietary," Brennan replied stiffly. "Convenient," I said. "Proprietary policies that can't be reviewed or challenged, applied at the discretion of staff who clearly harbor racial biases." "I resent the implication that my staff is racist," Brennan said. his voice rising slightly. We run a professional establishment that serves everyone equally. If you serve everyone equally, then you'll have no problem implementing clear written policies that prevent future discrimination. You'll also want to provide anti-bias training for your staff. Williams, Brennan said, standing up to signal the meeting was over. I've apologized for your experience. I'm not sure what more you expect. I expect you to take responsibility for discrimination that occurred in your restaurant and implement changes to prevent it from happening again. We don't believe discrimination occurred, Brennan said firmly. We believe there was a miscommunication that we've addressed internally. I sat in my car outside Bellacourt for 10 minutes after that meeting, processing what had just happened. Not only had they refused to acknowledge the obvious racism, they'd gaslighted me into thinking I was imagining it. This was the institutional protection of racism I'd heard about but never experienced so directly. They were closing ranks, creating alternative narratives, and dismissing my legitimate complaints as oversensitivity. That evening, I called my mentor, Professor Anderson, who'd retired but still kept up with industry developments. Keisha, he said after I'd explained the situation, this is bigger than just one bad experience. You're in a position to shine light on systemic problems in the hospitality industry. The question is, are you prepared for the fight they're going to put up? What do you mean? I asked. I mean they're going to try to destroy your reputation, he said bluntly. They'll question your credibility, your professionalism, your motives. They'll paint you as a troublemaker who's trying to profit from false accusations. Are you prepared for that? The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd worked 15 years to build my reputation in this industry. Taking on Bellacourt publicly could jeopardize everything I'd accomplished. But the alternative, letting them get away with blatant racism, felt like betraying every Black person who'd face similar treatment in the future. Professor, I said finally, if I don't fight this, who will? Over the next 2 weeks, I began gathering evidence and building my case. I started with a records request to the city's business licensing department, looking for any previous complaints against Bellacourt. I found 3 complaints in the past 5 years, all filed by customers of color alleging discriminatory treatment. None had been substantiated because the restaurant's flexible policies made it impossible to prove bias. I contacted Martin and Rebecca, who enthusiastically agreed to provide witness statements about what they'd observed. Martin went further, offering to testify about the stark difference in how he was treated versus how I was treated, despite wearing more casual attire than my business suit. Through my professional network, I quietly reached out to other Black professionals who might have experienced similar treatment at Bellacourt. Within a week, I'd connected with 4 other people who'd been refused service or treated poorly at the restaurant. Dr. Aisha Thompson, a prominent surgeon, had been told their private dining room was unavailable for her family's celebration dinner, only to see a white family seated there 30 minutes later. James Mitchell, a successful attorney, had experienced multiple delays and mix-ups with his reservation that mysteriously resolved when his white law partner arrived. Each story followed the same pattern: initial resistance or poor treatment, followed by gaslighting when they complained. Bellacourt had developed a sophisticated system for discriminating against Black customers while maintaining plausible deniability. I also began researching the restaurant's ownership structure. Bellacourt was owned by a small hospitality group called Premier Dining, which operated 3 upscale restaurants in the Bay Area. The majority owner was Robert Caldwell, a wealthy white investor with political connections throughout the city. His partners included the mayor's former campaign manager and a prominent real estate developer. This network of connections explained why previous complaints had gone nowhere. Bellacourt wasn't just a restaurant, it was part of a power structure that protected itself through influence and intimidation. The more I learned, the more determined I became to expose their practices. This wasn't just about my personal experience anymore, it was about a pattern of discrimination that had been allowed to continue because Black customers lacked the resources or platform to fight back effectively. 3 weeks after my initial meeting with Brennan, I received a letter from Bellacourt's attorney. The letter claimed I was spreading false and defamatory statements about the restaurant and demanding I cease all harassment of their business. They threatened legal action if I continued to malign their reputation. I showed the letter to Jasmine, whose nonprofit work had given her extensive experience with intimidation tactics. "This is exactly what Professor Anderson warned you about," she said. They're trying to scare you into backing down before you can build a strong case. So what do? I asked. You get yourself a civil rights attorney, she replied, and you document everything they just sent you as evidence of retaliation. That afternoon, I called the San Francisco office of the NAACP and was referred to attorney Peter Washington, a specialist in civil rights and discrimination cases. When I walked into his office and explained my situation, his expression grew increasingly serious. Miss Williams, he said, when I finished, what you're describing is a textbook case of racial discrimination. The fact that they're threatening you with legal action for reporting it shows they know exactly what they did wrong. What are my options? I asked. We can file complaints with the State Civil Rights Commission and the city's Human Rights Office, he said. But honestly, those processes can take years and often result in minimal consequences. The more immediate option is filing a federal lawsuit under civil rights statutes. What would that involve? It would make your case public, he warned. The restaurant industry is relatively small, and you'd be taking on powerful people with significant resources. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? I thought about Nana Mae's stories of my great-grandfather maintaining his dignity despite constant humiliation. I thought about my mama working double shifts to give me opportunities she never had. I thought about every Black professional who'd face similar discrimination if these practices continued unchallenged. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. Attorney Washington smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. Good, because we're going to need to be strategic about this. They have money and connections, but we have something more powerful, the truth, and a community that's tired of being treated like second-class citizens. Over the next month, we built a comprehensive case that went far beyond my individual experience. We documented the pattern of discrimination through witness statements, complaint records, and what Attorney Washington called audit testing, having Black and white customers with similar profiles attempt to make reservations and experience the difference in treatment. The audit results were damning. Black customers were significantly more likely to be told no tables were available, even when white customers calling immediately after were accommodated. When reservations were accepted, Black customers faced longer wait times, less attentive service, and frequent problems with their orders that white customers didn't experience. Meanwhile, my professional life began to suffer the consequences of taking on Bellacourt. Word spread through the tight-knit restaurant industry that I was involved in a situation with one of the city's most respected establishments. 2 potential clients canceled meetings without explanation. A conference that had invited me to speak suddenly found their program full. The retaliation was subtle but unmistakable. Restaurant owners who'd previously sought my expertise were suddenly choosing other consultants. My colleagues at Morrison & Associates began treating me differently, offering unsolicited advice about not burning bridges and maintaining professional relationships. During a particularly difficult week when 3 clients postponed projects indefinitely, I called Denise for support. Girl, she said, they're scared. You're threatening a system that's been working for them for decades. Of course they're going to push back. But what if this destroys my career? I asked, what if I've sacrificed everything I've worked for? And you'll rebuild, Denise replied firmly. But you'll rebuild as someone who stood up for what's right, and you'll have a community behind you that respects what you're doing. She was right about the community support. As word spread about my case against Bellacourt, I began receiving calls and emails from Black professionals across industries who'd experienced similar discrimination. Many offered to testify or provide statements supporting the lawsuit. The Black business community rallied around the case, understanding that my fight was their fight too. Dr. Thompson, the surgeon who'd been discriminated against at Bellacourt, became a particularly strong ally. Keisha, she said during one of our strategy meetings, I'd been thinking about this for months but didn't have the courage to speak up. Thank you for giving all of us a voice. The power of collective action became clear as our legal team assembled testimonies from dozens of Black customers who'd experienced discrimination at Bellacourt and other premier dining establishments. What had seemed like isolated incidents was revealed as systematic exclusion designed to maintain these restaurants as predominantly white spaces. 2 months after filing the lawsuit, we received Bellacourt's official response. Their attorneys denied all allegations of discrimination and countersued for defamation, claiming my false accusations had damaged their business reputation. They demanded monetary damages and a court order preventing me from making any further defamatory statements. The countersuit was clearly intended to intimidate me into dropping the case, but it had the opposite effect. Attorney Washington called it a gift because it demonstrated their consciousness of guilt and pattern of retaliation against discrimination complainants. They're scared, he explained. Innocent businesses don't threaten customers who report poor service. They certainly don't file lawsuits against civil rights complainants. This response shows they know they're legally vulnerable. The media attention began when a local food blogger picked up the story from court filings. Her article, "Beloved Restaurant Accused of Racial Discrimination," sparked conversations throughout the Bay Area's dining scene. Comments on the article revealed dozens of similar experiences at premier dining establishments, with Black customers sharing stories of refused reservations, poor service, and discriminatory treatment. The restaurant industry's response was predictably defensive. Several prominent chefs and restaurant owners issued statements supporting Bellecourt and questioning my motives. The president of the Bay Area Restaurant Association called my lawsuit an attack on hardworking hospitality professionals and suggested I was seeking undeserved financial gain. But support came from unexpected quarters. Chef Maria Santos, whose Mexican restaurant I'd helped turn around 3 years earlier, wrote a powerful editorial about witnessing discrimination in the industry. "I've seen how differently Black customers are treated," she wrote. "Keisha Williams is speaking truth that many of us have been afraid to acknowledge." The community mobilization reached a crescendo when Mount Olive Baptist Church organized a peaceful demonstration outside Bellecourt on a busy Saturday evening. Pastor Williams, no relation but someone who'd known my family for decades, spoke about the spiritual dimension of fighting injustice. "We're not here to destroy anyone's business," he said to the assembled crowd of about 200 people. "We're here to demand that all God's children be treated with dignity and respect." The demonstration was covered by local television news, bringing the case to wider public attention. The footage of well-dressed Black families peacefully protesting outside an upscale restaurant sparked conversations across the city about discrimination in public accommodations. That night, I received dozens of messages of support, but also several threatening calls from unknown numbers. Someone left a voicemail calling me a race-baiting troublemaker who was destroying good businesses for attention. Another caller suggested I go back where I came from if I didn't like how I was treated. The threats were frightening, but they also clarified the stakes. This wasn't just about restaurant service, it was about challenging systems of power that had operated with impunity for decades. The viciousness of the pushback proved how necessary this fight was. 3 months into the legal battle, we received our first major breakthrough. A former Bellecourt employee, Maria Rodriguez, contacted Attorney Washington with information about discriminatory practices she'd witnessed during her 2 years working there. They had this system, Maria explained during her deposition. Management would use code words to identify Black customers. They'd say someone looked urban or not our typical clientele. We were told to be extra careful about dress code enforcement and to double-check reservations if customers didn't sound right over the phone. Maria's testimony provided direct evidence of systematic discrimination. She described manager meetings where staff were explicitly told to maintain the restaurant's atmosphere by being selective about seating. She had contemporaneous notes from her employee handbook that included euphemistic language about maintaining standards that she'd recognized as coded racism. More damaging was her revelation that Premier Dining's owner Robert Caldwell had made explicitly racist comments during staff meetings. According to Maria, Caldwell had said the restaurants needed to preserve their upscale image and avoid becoming gathering places for certain demographics. Armed with Maria's testimony, Attorney Washington filed additional charges under federal civil rights statutes. The case was no longer just about my individual experience, but about proving systematic discrimination across Premier Dining's restaurant group. The media coverage intensified after Maria's testimony became public. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a front-page story titled "Server Reveals Discriminatory Practices at Upscale Restaurant Chain." The article included details about coded language and training practices designed to exclude Black customers while maintaining legal deniability. Bellacort's response was swift and predictable. They fired Maria Rodriguez for violating confidentiality agreements and making false statements to harm the company. They issued a statement calling her testimony the desperate accusations of a disgruntled former employee and maintained their innocence of any discriminatory practices. But Maria's firing backfired spectacularly. Employment lawyers lined up to represent her in a wrongful termination suit, and her treatment became a symbol of retaliation against workers who speak out against racism. The story gained national attention when it was picked up by civil rights organizations and shared widely on social media. The community response was overwhelming. Black customers organized boycotts of all premier dining establishments. Several prominent Black celebrities and athletes publicly supported the boycott, sharing their own experiences with discrimination at upscale restaurants. White allies joined the boycott, understanding that remaining silent meant complicity with racist practices. Within 2 weeks of the boycott announcement, Premier Dining's revenue dropped by 40%. Several high-profile events scheduled at their restaurants were canceled as organizers didn't want to be associated with businesses accused of discrimination. The financial pressure began taking its toll on the company's operations. Meanwhile, my own career began recovering as the broader context of my fight became clear. Restaurant owners who'd initially distanced themselves started reaching out, understanding that I was fighting for industry-wide change rather than personal vendetta. Morrison and Associates, initially concerned about controversy, began marketing my civil rights work as evidence of their commitment to social justice. The breaking point came when Robert Caldwell himself made a disastrous television appearance trying to defend his restaurants. During a confrontational interview, he repeatedly dismissed concerns about racism and suggested that discrimination complaints were part of a larger agenda to attack successful businesses. His comments were immediately condemned by civil rights organizations and restaurant industry groups. The mayor, previously supportive of Premier Dining, issued a statement distancing his administration from Caldwell's remarks. Several city council members called for investigations into the city's relationship with Premier Dining. More importantly, Caldwell's appearance prompted 3 additional former employees to come forward with testimonies about discriminatory training and practices. The pattern of evidence became overwhelming as server after server described explicit instructions to treat Black customers differently. Attorney Washington called the growing testimony a civil rights attorney's dream case because it demonstrated systematic, intentional discrimination rather than isolated incidents. Federal investigators opened a broader probe into Premier Dining's practices, and state civil rights officials announced their own investigation. The pressure on Premier Dining reached critical mass when their primary lender, Bay Area Community Bank, announced they were reviewing their relationship with the company. Several suppliers indicated they might terminate contracts if discrimination allegations were proven. The business infrastructure supporting Premier Dining began crumbling under public pressure. 4 months after filing the lawsuit, Attorney Washington received a call from Premier Dining's legal team requesting settlement negotiations. The company was ready to discuss resolving the case without admitting wrongdoing, but their initial offers were insulting, small financial settlements with non-disclosure agreements that would silence all complainants. They still don't understand, Attorney Washington told me after the first settlement meeting. They think this is about money. They don't realize this is about fundamental change in how they operate. I was clear about my priorities. Any settlement had to include substantial policy changes, anti-discrimination training for all staff, community oversight of their practices, and support for other customers who'd experienced discrimination. Financial compensation was secondary to ensuring these practices couldn't continue. The turning point came during our second settlement meeting when Premier Dining's attorney made a crucial mistake. Attempting to minimize the case, he suggested that isolated incidents of poor service didn't constitute systematic discrimination and that Black customers might be more sensitive to normal business interactions. Attorney Washington leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, "thank you for making our case for us. Those comments will make excellent evidence of your client's ongoing racist attitudes." The attorney's face went pale as he realized his error. Suggesting that Black customers were hypersensitive to discrimination was textbook evidence of racial bias. More importantly, he'd made these comments in the presence of court reporters and federal investigators. Within 48 hours, Premier Dining's legal team called requesting immediate negotiations. The company was hemorrhaging money from boycotts, losing suppliers, and facing federal investigation. Caldwell's political connections couldn't protect him from the growing scandal, and several investors were demanding resolution. The final settlement negotiations took place in a federal courthouse conference room with representatives from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division present. The government's involvement ensured that any agreement would have enforcement mechanisms and public accountability. In the terms we ultimately secured exceeded my highest expectations. Premier Dining agreed to pay $3 million in damages, $800,000 to me personally, with the remainder establishing a fund for other discrimination victims and community programs. They accepted federal monitoring of their operations for 5 years, with quarterly reports on hiring, seating practices, and customer service metrics. Most importantly, they agreed to comprehensive policy changes, written dress codes, and reservation policies that would be applied consistently to all customers, anti-bias training for all employees, promotion of diverse staff to management positions, and establishment of a customer advocacy position specifically focused on preventing discrimination. The settlement also included community benefits, $500,000 for diversity training programs in the hospitality industry, $300,000 for scholarships for students of color pursuing careers in restaurant management, and $200,000 for civil rights organizations to continue monitoring accommodation practices. Robert Caldwell was required to sell his ownership stake in Premier Dining within 6 months. The new ownership would include at least one person of color on the management team, and all restaurant locations would display clear anti-discrimination policies and reporting mechanisms for customers. But perhaps most satisfying was the public apology requirement. Premier Dining had to issue formal apologies acknowledging that discrimination had occurred at their establishments and committing to fundamental changes in their operations. The apology couldn't include legal disclaimers or weasel words. It had to be straightforward acceptance of responsibility. When Attorney Washington announced the settlement at a press conference, the room erupted in applause. Community members who'd supported the case throughout the legal battle celebrated not just the financial victory, but the systemic changes that would protect future customers. "This case was never about one person's bad experience," I said during my statement to the media. "It was about changing practices that have excluded and humiliated Black customers for decades." Today's settlement proves that discrimination has consequences and that our community has the power to demand change. The immediate aftermath of the settlement was overwhelming. Media requests poured in from across the country as civil rights organizations hailed the case as a model for challenging accommodation discrimination. My phone rang constantly with congratulations from family, friends, and professional colleagues who'd supported me throughout the fight. But the most meaningful responses came from Black customers who'd experienced similar discrimination at restaurants and other businesses. Dozens of people reached out to share their stories and express gratitude for fighting a battle they hadn't felt empowered to pursue themselves. Dr. Thompson called the settlement a watershed moment for civil rights in public accommodations. James Mitchell, the attorney who'd experienced discrimination at Bellecourt, said the case had inspired him to challenge bias in other professional settings where he'd previously remained silent. The financial compensation allowed me to take my career in new directions. I established a consulting firm specializing in diversity and inclusion for hospitality businesses, helping restaurants create genuinely welcoming environments for customers of all backgrounds. The demand for this expertise exploded as businesses realized that discriminatory practices weren't just morally wrong but financially devastating. Within 6 months of the settlement, I was consulting for restaurant chains across the Bay Area and beyond. My experience fighting discrimination gave me unique credibility when advising businesses about inclusive practices. Restaurant owners who'd previously been defensive about bias issues now sought guidance on preventing discrimination before it occurred. The scholarship fund established through the settlement began changing the demographics of restaurant management programs at local colleges. Young people of color who'd never considered hospitality careers suddenly had financial support and mentorship opportunities. I served on the scholarship selection committee, helping choose recipients who showed both academic promise and commitment to creating inclusive workplaces. The monitoring requirements for Premier Dining created fascinating case studies in organizational change. Federal oversight forced them to document every aspect of their customer service practices, revealing patterns of bias that had been invisible when left to individual discretion. Their quarterly reports showed gradual but measurable improvements in diverse hiring, equitable seating, and customer satisfaction across racial demographics. The industry-wide impact exceeded our expectations. Other restaurant groups proactively adopted similar anti-discrimination policies rather than risk facing legal challenges. The California Restaurant Association developed new training programs focused on bias prevention and inclusive service. Several cities updated their public accommodation ordinances to include stronger enforcement mechanisms. Most importantly, the case sparked conversations throughout the hospitality industry about the difference between colorblind service and genuinely inclusive service. Restaurant owners began understanding that treating everyone the same wasn't enough if underlying assumptions and practices systematically disadvantaged certain groups. My role evolved from discrimination victim to civil rights advocate. I began speaking at industry conferences about inclusive hospitality practices, sharing strategies for creating welcoming environments that went beyond basic legal compliance. The same industry that had initially ostracized me for filing the lawsuit now sought my expertise on preventing similar incidents. The personal healing process was complex and ongoing. The trauma of experiencing blatant discrimination, followed by months of legal battle and public scrutiny, had taken emotional tolls that financial victory couldn't instantly repair. I worked with a therapist who specialized in racial trauma, learning to process the hypervigilance and anger that had sustained me through the fight but weren't healthy for long-term well-being. Support from the Black professional community proved crucial for healing. Peter organized monthly dinners for Black business leaders who'd faced workplace discrimination, creating space to process shared experiences and develop collective strategies for change. These gatherings became a source of strength and perspective as we supported each other through various challenges. My relationship with my family deepened through the experience. Nana May, then 89, told me she was proud to see me carry forward the dignity and determination she'd instilled. "Baby girl," she said, "you did what I never could do. You made them pay for treating us less than human." Mama's response was more complex. She was proud of my victory but worried about the cost of challenging powerful people. "I raised you to be excellent so you wouldn't have to fight these battles," she said. "But I'm glad you had the strength to fight when excellence wasn't enough." The broader community impact became visible through changed practices across the Bay Area's restaurant scene. Black customer experiences improved measurably as businesses implemented inclusive training and clear anti-discrimination policies. The fear of facing similar lawsuits motivated proactive policy changes that benefited all customers of color. The federal monitoring of Premier Dining produced quarterly reports that became tools for advocacy in other discrimination cases. The data showed how systematic bias operated and how comprehensive policy changes could create measurable improvement. Civil rights attorneys across the country used our settlement as a template for challenging accommodation discrimination. A year after the settlement, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining discrimination in public accommodations. The hearing room was packed with civil rights advocates, industry representatives, and community members who'd traveled to Washington to support federal anti-discrimination legislation. The case against Premier Dining proved that civil rights laws work when they're properly enforced, I told the committee. But it also proved that individual victims shouldn't have to bear the burden of challenging systematic discrimination alone. We need stronger federal oversight and support for communities facing bias. The legislation ultimately passed with bipartisan support, strengthening enforcement mechanisms for public accommodation discrimination and providing federal funding for bias prevention programs. The law became known informally as the Bellecourt Amendment for its connection to our case. 2 years later, the transformation of Premier Dining's restaurant locations was remarkable. Federal monitoring had forced comprehensive changes that went far beyond basic legal compliance. Their workforce diversity improved dramatically, customer service ratings increased across all demographics, and they'd become a model for inclusive hospitality practices. The irony wasn't lost on me that the restaurants that had discriminated against me were now industry leaders in inclusive service. The settlement requirements had forced them to become the kind of establishment they should have been from the beginning. My consulting business expanded nationally as organizations realized that diversity and inclusion weren't just moral imperatives but business necessities. The Keisha Williams method for inclusive hospitality became a recognized framework taught in business schools and implemented by major restaurant chains. But the most meaningful measure of success was hearing from individual Black customers who felt confident dining at establishments that had previously excluded them. Young Black professionals told me they no longer experienced anxiety when entering upscale restaurants because policies were clear and accountability mechanisms existed. The legal precedent established by our case inspired similar lawsuits across the country. Attorney Washington estimated that our settlement had generated more than 50 additional accommodation discrimination cases, creating a network of legal pressure that forced systematic changes in hospitality practices. 5 years after that humiliating evening at Bellacourt, I returned to the restaurant for dinner. The establishment had been completely transformed under new ownership and federal oversight. The hostess, a young Black woman named Destiny, greeted me warmly and seated me immediately at the table of my choice. The server, Peter, different from my cousin, was attentive and professional without being obsequious. The service was excellent, the food outstanding, and the atmosphere genuinely welcoming to the diverse clientele that now filled the dining room. As I finished my meal, the general manager approached my table. "Miss Williams," she said, "I wanted to personally thank you for the changes your case brought to this restaurant. We're proud to serve all customers with dignity and respect." Looking around the transformed restaurant, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The humiliation I'd experienced in that same space had been transformed into systematic change that would protect countless future customers from discrimination. The journey from discrimination victim to civil rights advocate had been challenging but ultimately transformational. I'd learned that individual excellence, while necessary, wasn't sufficient to overcome systematic racism. Real change required collective action, legal pressure, and sustained community advocacy. The case taught me that fighting injustice isn't just about seeking personal vindication, but about clearing paths for others who might not have the resources or platform to challenge discrimination themselves. Every Black professional who now dines confidently at upscale restaurants benefits from battles fought by people who refuse to accept discriminatory treatment. The financial settlement allowed me to establish the Keisha Williams Foundation, which provides legal support for individuals facing accommodation discrimination. The foundation has handled more than 200 cases, creating a network of legal precedents that makes discrimination increasingly costly for businesses. My relationship with the hospitality industry evolved from adversarial to collaborative as business owners realized that inclusive practices weren't just legally required but economically beneficial. Restaurants that embraced diversity training and anti-bias policies saw improved customer satisfaction, employee retention, and community reputation. The speaking engagements and consulting work kept me connected to the ongoing struggle for civil rights while allowing me to influence industry practices from within. Young Black professionals often approached me after presentations, expressing gratitude for making spaces more accessible and inspiring them to challenge discrimination in their own workplaces. The community that supported me through the legal battle remained strong, evolving into a network of Black professionals committed to collective advancement. We'd learned that individual success was fragile without systematic change and that challenging injustice required sustained community effort. Professor Anderson, my mentor from Stanford, often said that true leadership meant being willing to fight battles that others couldn't afford to fight. The privilege of my professional success carried the responsibility to use that platform for collective advancement rather than just personal gain. The lessons I learned about recognizing and fighting systemic racism became tools I shared with other Black professionals navigating predominantly white spaces. The strategies that sustained me through the legal battle, community support, documentation, strategic planning, and maintaining dignity under pressure became frameworks for others facing similar challenges. The healing process taught me that victory in civil rights battles isn't just about legal outcomes, but about reclaiming dignity and self-determination. The discrimination at Bellacourt had been an attempt to make me question my worth and place in professional spaces. Fighting back and winning restored my sense of agency and belonging. The broader social impact became clear through feedback from community members who felt empowered to challenge discrimination in their own lives. Parents told me their children grew up believing they belonged in any space they could afford and were qualified to enter. That shift in expectations was perhaps the most important outcome of the entire struggle. Today, when I walk into any restaurant, I carry myself with the confidence that comes from knowing discrimination has consequences and that my community has the power to demand change. The hypervigilance that once accompanied me into white spaces has been replaced by calm assurance that I belong wherever I choose to go. The case against Bellacourt became a watershed moment for accommodation discrimination law and a turning point in my own understanding of civil rights advocacy. What began as a humiliating personal experience became a victory for community empowerment and systematic change. For every Black person who's ever been made to feel unwelcome in spaces you've earned the right to occupy, know that your dignity is worth fighting for. For every person who's witnessed discrimination and wondered whether speaking up would make a difference, understand that your voice matters and your support can change lives. The struggle for civil rights continues in courtrooms and boardrooms, in everyday interactions and systematic policy changes. Each of us has a role to play in creating a society where respect and dignity aren't conditional on race or background. If you've experienced discrimination in restaurants, retail, or any public accommodation, please share your story in the comments below. Document what happened, seek community support, and know that legal remedies exist when businesses choose discrimination over dignity. The community that supported me through this battle proved that collective action can overcome individual prejudice and systematic bias. Subscribe to join others who understand that civil rights are won through persistent effort, strategic action, and unwavering commitment to justice. Together, we can continue building a society where every person is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of the color of their skin or the assumptions others make about their worth. The fight continues, but victories like this prove that change is possible when communities unite for justice. Remember, you belong in every space you can afford and are qualified to enter. Your presence in those spaces isn't a privilege to be grateful for. It's a right to be exercised with confidence and dignity. When that right is challenged, know that you have a community ready to stand with you and legal tools available to demand accountability. The transformation of Bellacourt from a symbol of discrimination to a model of inclusive service proves that systematic change is possible when communities refuse to accept inferior treatment. What happened to me could happen to anyone, but the response we organized together showed that discrimination doesn't have to be the final word in anyone's story. Stand up, speak out. Document everything. Build alliances. Demand change. Your dignity is worth fighting for, and your community is ready to fight with you.